Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Hopefully, this is actually recording, but welcome back once again to an exciting episode of World Civilizations online class. We are, of course, on week 12, and we're going to be looking at the Cold War in Asia today, continuing our theme of looking at the Cold War. Which, again, don't worry, in case any of you were concerned, the posting of lectures will be done normally this week. Things should be getting relatively back to normal. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and go over your key terms for today, as always. We're going to very briefly look at the Korean War and look at General Douglas MacArthur, who was heavily involved in the Korean War. We'll also spend quite a bit of time looking, as you might imagine, at the Vietnam War, looking specifically at the My Lai Massacre, the experience of Vietnam prisoners of war, and looking at the U.S. Army Air Cavalry. Now again, as always, I do want to make sure you're aware of important upcoming dates. For instance, your third writing assignment is coming up on November the 13th at 5 p.m. The prompt and rubric are, of course, already on Moodle, as they have been the whole semester. So by the time you're watching this, you should have hopefully already started looking over that prompt and rubric and making sure you're prepared for the assignment. Your fourth content quiz will come up the next week on November the 20th at 5 p.m. And your third debate is going to come up on November the 30th at 5 p.m. At the time of making this PowerPoint, I had not done this yet, but there should now be available a Google Sheet for you in the Debate 3 section of Moodle, where you can go ahead and start signing up for potential times, and where you can go ahead and pick your team for the upcoming debate. If you have any problems with that, please do let me know, but please go ahead and start looking at potential times you can participate. As you might imagine, this one's going to be a little bit tricky because the official due date for this debate is after Thanksgiving. I didn't want to schedule your debate during Thanksgiving break, obviously, so there's only a few instances where I was only able to put really a couple of days where this debate could happen. So please make sure you sign up as soon as possible, so it's more likely we're able to actually have the debate. Those of you who are in the debate, I think, can agree it went pretty well, and I thought it was actually a fun thing to take part of. So I would like to still have this debate if at all possible, despite of how complex it's probably going to be. But anyway, as always, if you have any questions about these assignments, please let me know. But otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and move on from them for now. In the meantime, to get things started looking at the Cold War in Asia, you have to be aware essentially of what went on in China. To give you a bit of historical context that I didn't mention too much earlier, the communists and the nationalists in China have been fighting a civil war since the 1920s. As you might imagine, though, as Japan invaded China during World War II, these two groups joined forces and began fighting the Japanese collectively in 1936. However, as you might also imagine, very similarly, for example, how the alliance between the USSR and the United States ended after the Cold War, the nationalists and the communists resumed their conflict after the war, and by 1949, Mao Zedong, who you can see here, and his communists had won a series of victories across China and forced the president of China and the leader of the nationalists, Chiang Kai-shek, to flee to Taiwan. This, of course, led to the start of the communist regime in China. This unique form of communism was known as Maoism due to a few of its differences from the USSR. We don't have a ton of time to talk about them, but for example, in Maoism, he believed that the peasants of the countryside in China should serve as the revolutionary vanguard or the chief troops of this revolution, instead of the proletariat of Marxism or the factory workers who should seize the means of production. He believed that giving China agrarian independence was more important than seizing factories, because, as you might also be aware, China was primarily still an agricultural economy and agricultural society at this time. For Mao, getting the peasants together was a bit more important. Mao also participated and led the Cultural Revolution, which was a destruction of pre-communist Chinese culture. So any sort of artifacts or literature that called to China's pre-communist past could be destroyed, and many intellectuals such as historians, professors, artists, and things like that could also be arrested or killed. So for example, if I was a Chinese history professor living in communist China, I might not have had a very good time. This difference in ideology, which again is much more complicated than I can really explain here, did cause a split between China and the USSR, lasting between 1956 and 1966, Fortunately for the Western world, perhaps, preventing these countries from ever really working too closely together. But anyway, to go ahead and get into the thick of things, we're going to look at the Cold War in Korea. The Cold War in Korea essentially can see it starts at the start in the Potsdam Conference of 1945. There, America, China, and Great Britain agreed that Korea was going to become a free and independent country after it was liberated from the Japanese. General Douglas MacArthur carried out this surrender plan known as General Order 1 on behalf of the Allies. Japanese troops north of the 38th parallel would surrender to the USSR. That map, which you can see that area, which you can see right here, by the way. Troops south would surrender to the United States. Now, what do you think the likely problems are with this plan? Our first awkward pause of the day. But yes, very good. As you might imagine, neither side is likely to be willing to give up their control of Korea. So this is essentially just going to lead to a lack of cooperation and further conflict. This became apparent pretty quickly. So we'll go over the prelude to war to the Korean War, which is actually technically a police action since war was never officially declared, but that doesn't sound as fun when you're giving some sort of documentary or making a movie. But anyway, in 1945, after the Japanese did surrender, Stalin closed off all access north of the 38th parallel. So no one who was not a direct ally of the USSR was able to get into this region of Korea, again, north of that 38th parallel. By 1948, the United Nations had sent in delegates to monitor free elections, but were denied access to the north. By 1950, North Korean troops had crossed over the 38th parallel and pretty swiftly defeated the South Korean army. Because of this, Truman began to quickly supply South Korean troops to help them fight the Chinese and Soviet-backed North Korean forces, who they were very much outmatched by. This led to a later UN resolution where the United States called a special session of the Security Council, which then demanded that North Korea withdraw immediately from Korea, and that the UN, all other United Nations members, should give America every assistance possible in order to make this happen. So again, very quickly, just within 5 years, the lack of access and cooperation Stalin is providing is helping us escalate into a war. Couple of early military actions that went on in this conflict. In 1950, America was not actually very heavily engaged in the war. This was because the army, as you might imagine, had shrunk quite a bit after the conclusion of World War II. By 1950, it had already dropped to 591,000 enlisted men, compared to the 8,267,958 who were enlisted in 1945. The U.S. 8th Army was actually initially sent alone to this conflict, being involved in the Battle of Taehan, where they did eventually push the North Korean troops back beyond the Naktong River, which you can not quite see depicted in this map. My apologies. Fortunately for them, reinforcements did arrive, and Seoul, the capital of South Korea, was recaptured, which you can see on this map if I'm smart enough to find it. Yeah, you can see on Seoul on this map right here, I believe. And if not, it is on a map somewhere, I do promise. Probably should have picked a better map, but hindsight is 2020. In the meantime, by October the 1st, South Korean troops were able to invade North Korea, and Truman ordered the United Nations troops to follow. Now, one thing this map can potentially show you, I think, is whether or not this was a good idea. Is it wise for the United States and the UN to invade North Korea? Awkward pause again. Yeah, and to help illustrate that, let's again look at this map for a second. There's Seoul, by the way. I found it. But yes, as you can see, probably the major problem is the potential international aspect of this war. What is to the north and on the border of North Korea? Obviously China. Very good again, imaginary class hopefully watching this at home. Remember, one of the major problems of the Cold War is that if you get too heavily involved in a conflict and get too aggressive, nuclear missiles might start flying, and then we're all going to die. So getting the Chinese too involved in the war was not considered to necessarily be a good idea. As you might imagine, this did go south very quickly. The Chinese did almost immediately launch a counteroffensive once the United Nations and U.S. troops, got too close to their border. About 200,000 Chinese troops attacked the UN troops at the Battle of Unsan, and also conducted the infamous Chosin Reservoir ambush, still considered to be one of the worst ambushes in US military history. When 120,000 Chinese troops ambushed the United Nations troops, this conflict was so intensive that the 31st Infantry Regiment suffered about 3,000 casualties alone, which, for those of you who are familiar with sort of military organization, would probably recognize as most of its men. By January 4th, 1951, the UN troops had been pushed south of Seoul all the way back to the port of Incheon, however you say it, which again, I believe you can see, yes, on this map right here. There we go. So, this of course is not a good state for the troops to be in, which led to General Douglas MacArthur, who you can again see here, getting a little bit more aggressive. He sent UN troops to the Chinese border during the early offensive. He bombed the Yilu bridges, which were used as supply lines of transportation, including the Chinese side of these bridges. He also called for an invasion of China after the second recapturing of Seoul, which occurred by March of 1951. This is part of a protest against the Dai for Tai plan, as it was known by the UN. In response to this Chinese counteroffensive, the United States realized and the United Nations realized that it would be very difficult to have a total war and a total victory in North Korea without again antagonizing the Chinese, which is something no one really wanted to do at this point. Therefore, many military men and many soldiers were upset at this die for tie plan, where they felt they were essentially dying in order for there to just be a tie. And instead of accepting his aggressive stance, Truman actually did relieve him from his command on April 11th, 1951. One thing I'd like you to consider as we continue discussing the Cold War is whether or not Truman made the right decision in this case. Did he do the right thing by dumping MacArthur at this point? Give you a second to ponder that. I'd love to discuss this in person, but we just have technology. Anyway, in the meantime, this recognition of the likely die for tie plan led to more peace talks, but also some further violence. Armistice talks began in the Korean War by about June 30th, 1951, and lasted until July 27th, 1953. The reason the talks lasted so long is that it would be frequently suspended while each side would try to strengthen its position through conflict. For example, the battles of Bloody Ridge and Heartbreak Ridge, as you can see depicted here, occurred during these armistice talks, which resulted in about 6,000 American casualties. And between June and August of 1952, the UN troops invaded the Yalu River, which I believe you can see in this map. There you go. And they also bombed Pyongyang. By July 27, 1953, both sides had signed an armistice and withdrew 2 kilometers from their current positions, which today is known as the Demilitarized Zone, separating North Korea and South Korea. Now, just to sort of summarize the impact of this conflict, what do you think it reveals about the conditions and realities of armed conflict during the Cold War? All right, very good. Again, it essentially reveals the limited nature that conflict could take during the Cold War. Remember that mutually assured destruction issue we talked about earlier. No one's really willing to have a very large open conflict because if you do that, you again might irritate larger world powers and potentially have nuclear warfare. No one's really willing to risk that at this point, so many conflicts throughout the Cold War we're going to have to accept limited results such as the Korean War. Now, a couple of important legacies of the war. The one positive of the Korean War was the development of the Mobile Army Surgical Hospitals, known as MASH, that became active during the Korean War. These areas only provided short-term recovery. They were essentially just to make sure patients were stabilized and alive while they were moved to long-term care, but it did raise the chances of survival for a wounded troop who got to this MASH unit to about 97 to 98%. These did also inspire the MASH TV series, which ran from 1972 to 1983, a clipping of which I've given you right here. In the meantime, we will go ahead and look at the start of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War is, of course, one of the more infamous examples of Cold War conflicts, and has particularly had a big impact on United States history and United States foreign reputation. But in the meantime, let's give that thing I love to always talk about, historical conflict for this war. The beginnings of the Vietnam War can actually be seen all the way back in 1884. This was when France claimed Vietnam as a colony. By 1921, Vietnamese individuals who didn't like this idea, led by Ho Chi Minh, had created something called the Viet Minh. This was a nationalist independence party who essentially just wanted freedom for Vietnam. Throughout World War II, the situation in Vietnam got even more complicated and worse. During this time, Vietnam became a co-French and Japanese colony. These dual policies and dual rulers were so ineffective that it's estimated that about 2 million Vietnamese starved during World War II. Which, by the way, again, just maybe a bit of trivia, really. Why did this colony become a co-French Japanese colony? What happened that made that possible? Forgive all my sips of water, but I've been already talking for like 2 hours. I need a break. But yes, as you might remember, the French surrendered to the Axis powers and Nazi Germany in particular during World War II. After this, the Japanese were given dual control of the colony as a reward for their alliance. But in the meantime, the United States, as you might imagine, supported Ho Chi Minh in his conflict against the Japanese. Enemy by enemy is my friend and all that. However, after the war was over, the United States eventually supported France in their attempt to reclaim control of Vietnam. Now, why do you think they would do that, particularly considering the Cold War that was getting ready to start? Awkward pause again. Alright, yeah, remember the Cold War is going on, which, as I've said before, basically colors and gives context to everything going on during this time period. The United States was essentially not willing to risk alienating France after World War II was over, so they wouldn't lose a valuable ally against the USSR. This caused them to basically, again, abandon their Vietnamese allies to support the more powerful French. As you might imagine, Ho Chi Minh did not react well to this, and this helped directly lead to his conflict with the United States after the French were kicked out of Vietnam, which occurred between September 1945, September in 1945 to May the 7th in 1954. This was the First Indochina War, or Indochina War, which resulted in France abandoning Vietnam and splitting the country into northern and southern halves. Ho Chi Minh got the north, Ngo Dien Diem, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, got the south. Now, as I said, this helped lead very quickly to more conflict with the United States and the capitalist world, which, as you will see here, I'm actually going to very quickly summarize. Just to explain myself a little bit, this is mainly because I'm sure most of you who are familiar with the Vietnam War are most familiar with the military aspects of it, which makes total sense and is a very important part of the war, obviously. It's what war is. But since this is a survey course, I felt it was more important to give you a bit more understanding of the impacts of the war than just the day-to-day life of it. Again, not to say that's not important, but since I had to cover, again, a very large amount very quickly, we're going to go through the military aspect pretty fast. Now, from 1961 to 1964, the U.S. only sent technical, military, and financial aid to South Vietnam to help them fight the North Vietnamese. There were no boots on the ground during this period. Now, why do you think they were so reluctant to wage direct war in Vietnam? Think what we just talked about, for example, during this awkward pause. Alright, again, very good imaginary class. This is another example of the limited war that was available during the Cold War. The United States was a bit reluctant to get too heavily involved because they didn't want to draw in more Soviet or potentially Chinese involvement. So again, very limited involvement throughout much of the war, really. This started to change throughout Operation Rolling Thunder when there were bombing raids done on the supply line called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. However, these bombing raids were limited by the trail's proximity to China. So again, you can't really wage the total war you want to because you don't want to risk antagonizing your larger and more powerful enemies. To give you a bit of an idea of what the actual day-to-day conflict of Vietnam was like, we will go over a few of the major conflicts. For example, there was the Ia Drang battle, where airborne troops were dropped into a valley and were ambushed with about 300 casualties. Which again, that gives you actually a very quick summary of what the conflict in the Vietnam War was like. Due to the vast jungles and relatively undeveloped roads in the country, you couldn't really have large standing armies having huge open conflicts. It was more of small groups going in to fight guerrilla warriors hiding in the jungle. So therefore, as we'll talk about a little bit more at the end of class, a lot of airborne troops being dropped into the jungle during this war. The Battle of Long Vay helps to show the brutality of the war, where North Vietnamese troops used Russian tanks. So again, the Soviets also aren't getting super directly involved either, they're just supplying like the United States did. But these tanks were used to attack a Green Beret outpost and killed about half of the Green Beret there. The Tet Offensive was one of the more infamous battles and serious conflicts in the war, where the Viet Cong, which by the way was the North Vietnamese guerrilla group hiding out in the south, attacked the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Now, why would this be so significant to the United States and the rest of the world? Again, I still don't know what to do during the awkward pauses. If any of you guys have any advice, feel free to email me. Reasonable stuff, of course. But yes, as you might imagine, this was essentially a big blow to the United States' reputation. Because this seemed to show that not only was the United States not able to have a quick resolution to the conflict and defeat their enemies, this seemed to suggest that they couldn't even protect their own territory and their own property in South Vietnam, which they were supposed to control. So essentially, big blow to their reputation and showed that the North Vietnamese were really nowhere close to giving up. The conflict got even worse with the Cambodian bombings, which was when President Nixon, who was president by this point, decided to bomb Cambodia throughout the 1970s to hurt their supply lines. This again was seen as a foolhardy move by many because they thought it was going to draw in more international involvement. The United States was actually so convinced that this international involvement and the lack of being able to defeat the guerrilla warriors meant that the war was completely unwinnable. So by March 28, 1975, the last United States troops had pulled out of Vietnam, and Saigon had fallen to North Vietnamese troops by April 30th. So just barely a month later. Now, so again, like I said, the military aspect of the war is obviously hugely important. What I want to do for the rest of the class is just give you a pretty quick rundown of some of the major problems with Vietnam and why it has such a problematic reputation in American history and to the world at large. For starters, corruption was widespread in both governments, so there wasn't really a very good side to support no matter what you did. For example, Diem, who the United States again supported in his control of South Vietnam, was known for persecuting Buddhists. As you can see in this picture right here, he had his own torture policy against Buddhist priests. He would lock up peasants in forts who didn't support him. He practiced nepotism within his government, was accused of having rigged elections, and had his own secret police for political opponents. Ho Chi Minh, on the other hand, in his rule of the North and way later the whole country, wasn't really any better and was potentially worse. For example, he was well known for his purification policy, particularly after the war was over, where he oversaw potentially up to 13,500 executions of his opponents. Political suppression was very common for years in North Vietnam, and mass graves were discovered, for example, after the Tet Offensive, of political opponents and enemies to the national or the freedom of Vietnam as they saw it. So again, very horrible governments really on both sides. Now, to give you a bit of an idea of, again, why some of these protests would be so powerful and how they might have affected people's perception of Vietnam, I do have a link to a video where, again, this monk, whose name I won't try to pronounce, was because I don't want to disrespect this individual particularly. He was the first individual to perform the suicidal protest, which was where the Buddhist monks would douse themselves in gasoline and light themselves on fire in public in broad daylight on the street. So again, he performed this fourth suicidal protest on June 11th of 1963. I do have this video, like I said, linked for you to watch. I do want to emphasize this one is not required. It's definitely not for the faint of heart, I suppose, for lack of a better way to put it on the top of my head. So if you don't think you can handle it, feel free to skip. Even if I had some way of knowing whether or not you watched it, I wouldn't think any less of you. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and move on and look a little bit more again at why the war was so unpopular. This is a bit focusing on why it was so unpopular in the United States, but it did help to again influence its reputation across the world. One of the major problems of this conflict was the reported massacres that occurred. It wasn't just these North Vietnamese massacres I already referred to a little bit. United States soldiers were also accused of participating in massacres as well. One of the most well known and highly reported was the My Lai massacre, where 150 to 500 Vietnamese citizens were killed by U.S. troops. A couple of accounts of this you can see below. The first comes from Sergeant Michael Bernhardt. He said, "I saw them shoot an M79 grenade launcher into a group of people who were still alive. But it was mostly done with a machine gun. They were shooting women and children just like anybody else." This is something he later told to a reporter. Later, a veteran named Thompson said, "We met no resistance and I only saw 3 captured weapons. We had no casualties. It was just like any other Vietnamese village, old Papasans, men, women, and kids. As a matter of fact, I don't remember seeing one military-age male in the entire place, dead or alive." We kept flying back and forth, and it didn't take very long until we started noticing the large number of bodies everywhere. Everywhere we'd look, we'd see bodies. These were infants, 2, 3, 4, 5-year-olds, women, very old men. No draft age people whatsoever. This is a response given at the My Lai conference at Tulane University in 1994. So again, as you might imagine, this made the conflict extremely unpopular when these kind of things became public. Part of the problem, or as part of the issue, was the reporter access to the war. The Vietnam War was surprisingly open to media. Seasoned reporters to high school newspapers were given complete access to reporting the Vietnam War, which helped ensure that massacres like this would be very widely known. The war became even more unpopular in the United States after the Kent State Massacre. This occurred on May 4th, 1970, when National Guardsmen fired live rounds at student protesters at the campus, killing about 4 and wounding 11 individuals. The war was also protested in 1968 in Chicago, when 26,000 troops and National Guardsmen and police beat and tear gassed protesters during the Democratic National Convention. So again, hugely unpopular war for reasons both in Vietnam and back home. Also, the veterans struggle is very well known, which again, many of you who probably know Vietnam veterans in your own personal lives are probably a bit aware of. One of the major problems for Vietnam veterans was how prisoners of war were treated. They were treated very brutally, would often be marched and beaten throughout North Vietnamese cities, were locked in concrete boxes, and were frequently tortured. For example, John McCain, who would eventually, of course, run for President of the United States, for those of you who can remember back that far at this point, was taken prisoner during the Vietnam War and later gave this account. To get back to the story, they took me out of my room to Slopehead, who said, "You have violated all the camp regulations. You're a black criminal. You must confess your crimes." I said that I wouldn't do that, and he asked, "Why are you so disrespectful of guards?" I answered, "Because the guards treat me like an animal." When I said that, the guards, who were all in the room, about 10 of them, really laid into me. They bounced me from pillar to post, kicking and laughing and scratching. After a few hours of that, ropes were put on me, and I sat that night bound with ropes. Then I was taken to a small room. For punishment, they would almost always take you to another room where you didn't have a mosquito net or a bed or any clothes. For the next 4 days, I was beaten every 2 or 3 hours by different guards. My left arm was broken again, and my ribs were cracked. So again, obviously very traumatic experience for many Vietnamese veterans who were taken prisoner. However, there were also widespread psychological and physical trauma issues, which could be seen more commonly in any Vietnam veteran. One of the problems historians and psychologists have identified arose actually in World War II. During this time, there was a study that showed that only about 15% of soldiers were actively firing their weapons in battle. Because of this, basic training was altered in order to more heavily encourage soldiers to kill and enjoy killing. If you want a good depiction of this, for example, I would recommend watching the movie by Stanley Kubrick, The Full Metal Jacket. Very depressing movie, but it's been hailed for doing a very good job of showing what basic training was like leading up to the Vietnam War. Killing the enemy became very highly emphasized. Whether this was necessary or not, many have argued that this did lead to a lot of psychological issues for veterans. For example, about 30% of men and 27% of women involved in the Vietnam War have reported various PTSD symptoms at some point in their life, ranging from depression, drug use, to nightmares. There were about 200 reported instances of fragging as well, or killing your officer, throughout the Vietnam War as well, much higher than similar incidences in World War II. Also, one of the more well-known medical problems of the Vietnam War came from Agent Orange. Agent Orange, which you can see depicted here, was a chemical that was dropped over the jungles of Vietnam in order to kill the guerrilla warriors' tree cover. It is estimated that this chemical gave about 3 million Vietnamese and 2.8 million veterans various medical complications, including cancer. So again, many problems for veterans in particular. Now, in order to wrap things up, since again I have taken up a bit of your time already today, we will just talk a little bit more about some of the new methods of war that helped separate Vietnam from other wars. As I said, due to the large jungles across the country, open conflicts are very rare, so the United States heavily relied upon the U.S. Army Air Cavalry. These are helicopter units that replaced tanks and armored personal carriers that again couldn't really be useful in the jungle. The most common was the Bell UH-1 Huey helicopter, which would be used to drop infantry in a landing zone, or an LZ. So any of you Call of Duty people who've heard that term, this is where it came from. You're welcome. These helicopters carried M60 machine guns and rocket launchers, along with the troops, of course, they had. Excuse me. These units were so heavily utilized that the 1st Cavalry actually suffered the highest casualty rate in the entire war. About 5,444 men were killed in the 1st U.S. Air Cavalry, and about 26,592 were wounded in action. So again, very costly war. So, what I'd like you to do to reflect leading up to future assignments like the debate is ask yourself these couple of questions. How do we deal with the complex issues of Vietnam today, and how exactly should we remember the Vietnam War? But again, I'll leave that for you to decide mainly on your own time. In the meantime, just remember these assignments we have coming up over the next few weeks. And once again, please let me know if you have any questions or concerns. Thank you, and have a great day.